Last week, we were reading about physics, modern physics, and its implications for religion, as well as beginning to read about concepts of God. And we'll continue reading this week about concepts of God, particularly those that attempt to be compatible with the findings of modern science. Hopefully, you got to read my piece, the encyclopedia piece about panentheism last week. If not, hopefully you'll read it this week. But I'll be doing too many lectures this week for this week, and the first one is on panentheism. So hopefully you have with you as you're watching this, either on a screen or printed out, the notes for this presentation. Panentheism comes from Greek. Three words basically make it up. Pan meaning all, en, a version of from Greek, and theo is the Greek word for God. Theism, belief in God. So literally, panentheism means all is in God. This understanding of God developed it was developed basically by Christian ministers in Germany in the 19th century, the 1800s. You can see the basic depiction, right? God is the all-inclusive reality, but the world is within God as far as making a drawing or spatializing or making an image out of this idea of panentheism. But what's the background for this idea that the world is in God? In Christian theology, it's always been held that God is transcendent, and trans is a prefix that means across and indeed beyond. And in this context, it would mean that God is above and beyond the world, right? God is not physically bound to the world. And we can also talk about qualities of God that are beyond any qualities like being knowledgeable, that are beyond any qualities that we humans or any other finite created being has. Now, and we talked about deism. You've read about deism, the idea that developed in the Enlightenment, that God, with all the discovery of all these scientific laws, God doesn't need to be involved in the world. So deism held that God created the world with these perfect natural laws, and then doesn't intervene, maybe doesn't even need to know about what's going on in the world. So transcendence already tended to make God somewhat distant, at least when it was focused on a good bit. And then deism takes this even further. And there still is around, and certainly was in the 1800s, kind of the idea that God is up in heaven, right? And we're down here on earth. Years ago, and there's still maybe some of these around, but a rich business person put up a lot of signs that were black in background and had white lettering with a quotation supposedly from God. And my favorite was the one that said, "Don't make me come down there, God." You know, the idea that God only makes an occasional appearance when things get really out of hand, when things get really bad. So these panentheists felt that the Christian and in general the Western idea of God emphasized way too much God's transcendence. You also had in the background ideas from ancient and medieval theology that came into modern theology, that God is not affected by anything. The theological term is impassibility. Nothing affects God. God causes things to happen, but nothing can change or affect God in any way. God doesn't have emotions because those affect one. So impassibility meant God had no feelings. Um, God acted in compassionate ways, but God did not feel compassion. God did not feel disappointment. God did, when things went wrong in the world, God did not suffer with us. All of that was involved with this idea of impassibility, along with the idea that God is eternal in the sense of timeless, that God doesn't experience time God's self. God knows that time progresses for us created beings, right? But it's all complete. Time is all one complete whole for God's unchanging vision. So God is not immediately involved in any way in the nitty gritty of life, according to traditional or classical Christian ideas of God. And so these Christian thinkers, theologians, and philosophers were having a lot of problems with these traditional and as well as this deistic idea of God that overemphasized how God is so much above and beyond the world. The other major term used in relative to God's relationship to the world in Christian theology is immanence. It means that God is in the world, uh, even though God is also beyond the world in so many ways. God is in the world in the sense that God causes things to happen in the world, maybe intervenes miraculously in traditional theology, but this became suspect to many Christians and theologians and philosophers with the Enlightenment, with modern science. So deism was suspicious of divine interventions, totally suspicious, and panentheism also is suspicious of violations of the natural laws that God has instituted. But the contrasting term is immanence, and panentheists felt that immanence was not emphasized as much as it should be. So they are attempting to have this proper balance between God's immanence, God being in the world, and God's transcendence, God being beyond the world. So panentheism would say not only that God is in some sense in the world, but the world is in God. Now, as you might recall, the understanding of nature, the nature of the physical world was very mechanistic in early modern science with the Enlightenment. It was reductionistic, right? The whole is just a matter of the sum of the parts, right? And you have these independent billiard balls and atoms that are just kind of obeying natural laws, and it's all total. If you knew the initial position of everything, everything would be absolutely predictable, at least to an all-knowing God. Well, in the 1800s, as we've already talked about, a more organistic view of nature was returning, right? As science learned about fields and electromagnetism. And so, and this was the time of Romanticism, which tended to be more holistic and tried to get away from just the Enlightenment emphasis on dispassionate reason and getting back to feelings and emotions. And so all of this worked to push these theologians to advance this idea of panentheism, where instead of mechanism and the whole being the sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So the ultimate whole of reality is God as the all-inclusive one, God including the world in this larger whole. So a more organistic understanding and the idea that God is involved. God is sustaining the world, and God is knowing and caring and feeling what goes on in the world. Totally contrary to impassibility, God feels all of our emotions. And God is, to the extent there is suffering, God feels that and experiences sadness or some divine equivalent of that or disappointment. And to the extent there is positive feeling, happiness, joy, exhilaration, God feels that and experiences a divine version of happiness with all the good things that happen in the world that is part of God. So that's a big a big change from traditional ideas that again, without the supernatural intervention from outside, you don't for panentheism you don't need the supernatural intervention because God is already in the world. The world is already within God. Now, generally, panentheists would caution that panentheism, at least literally, is a metaphor. We're not talking about God being a physical or spatial reality, and the world is a physical, spatial thing within that larger spatial reality. No, it's a metaphor. It's metaphorical. It's not materialistic. It's not spatial. And generally, panentheists would say that just because we're part of God or part of the divine life, that doesn't make us divine. That doesn't make us God. And talking about immanence, pantheism is the understanding of the divine that very much emphasizes divine immanence. Indeed, it literally means all is divine. You could translate it all as God, but God tends to have the connotation and the meaning of a person or who is distinct from other persons. So, it wouldn't quite do to say we're all gods. No, pantheism would mean everything in its deepest reality and its essence is divine, and there's one divine reality overall. But so pantheism would say that we are divine, at least in our deepest nature, but panentheism would say no. Even though we're part of God, we are not God. For God, as the including whole, is greater than the parts or the sum of the parts. So your toenail is part of you, and hopefully you're wise, and maybe you become wiser as you've taken this course, I hope. But we wouldn't say that your toenail is wise just because it's part of you. So neither would panentheism say that you are divine or I am divine just because we're part of God, part of God's life. And only God then is necessary, only God is omnipresent, only God is all-knowing, and none of us included parts are present everywhere or know everything that there is to know. And panentheists would typically say God does not know the whole future because that still will be decided. Because panentheism does another thing, it wants to emphasize freedom. we, even though we're part of God, God and God sustains us, gives us our existence. Um, God does not control everything we do. Now, in your reading, you might have noticed that Polkinghorne is okay with the phrase "we're part of God's life" that I sometimes like to use to uh, clarify what I mean, and I think most panentheists mean. Uh, but Polkinghorne seems to think, or does think, that, well, if you say we're part of God, that implies or means we're divine. And again, I'd reject that interpretation, and so would most panentheists. We can say that for God, and typically this you know was not believed by traditional or classical theism, but an internal relation is something that affects you. It is taken into you and affects you. So if we're all part of God, if the whole world is part of God, nothing is finally external to God. Maybe in some way distinct from God, right? The parts are not exactly the same as the including whole, but nothing is external to God. All relationships are internal, and so God is affected by these relationships, even as if we take uh, into ourselves and are affected by the pains or the joy of someone we care about, that becomes an internal relationship. If we just see something out there and it has no effect on us, we just notice it, that's an external relationship. Well, in traditional theism, all relationships were external, all in classical theism, right? Because nothing affected God. God was impassible. But for panentheism, everything is part of God, and all relationships are internal to God. Panentheists generally like the analogy of the world as the body of God. Now, an analogy means that something is like as well as unlike. So, we are dependent on our bodies, right? If our body dies, that means we die, and maybe we live on uh, without a body, or maybe, as Paul talked about it, we live on with another kind of body, a spiritual body in an afterlife realm. But we are very dependent on our bodies for our existence. God is not dependent on the world in order to exist, according to panentheism. And the generally panentheism doesn't entail that the universe is metaphysically necessary. Maybe we'll talk about process theology, which is a kind of panentheism, which says that, well, God is going to always have some universe, but certainly no particular universe has to exist. And and some panentheists would say, well, at least theoretically, God might not have created a universe, although panentheists believe that it's really in God's nature that God wants to have a universe. So there will be a universe that is part of God, that is part of the divine life. So there's my overview of panentheism. Hopefully, as you've been reading Barber, who's a panentheist, as you've read about Peacock, who is a panentheist, those have kind of been maybe the three biggest thinkers in the religion and science dialogue over the years. They're all were winners of the Templeton Prize, the largest prize in the world, monetarily larger than the Nobel Prize, and that's specifically for those who foster dialogue, interaction between religion and the sciences. So, along with reading my article and my overview, hopefully you're pretty clear now on the meaning and the significance of panentheism as a possible understanding of God that may be compatible with modern science.